Hi, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to TradeWinds, our new bi-weekly virtual event series where we will explore the future of global commerce in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. Today, in our first session, we will discuss a topic that lies at the heart of the future of global trade and investment, which is the disruption of global value chains and the role of international trade cooperation. And to lead our discussion, we have not two, but actually three great speakers. First, the Honorable Mary Ng, Canada's Minister of International Trade, Small Business and Export Promotion, also a Member of Parliament. She is joined by Ambassador Stephen DeBoer, Canada's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, who will take over from Minister Ng as she leads later for a cabinet meeting. Minister Ng and Ambassador DeBoer have been at the forefront of Canada's initiatives to foster trade cooperation in these challenging times, and we will hear more about that. And last but not least, we have our own Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, who has written extensively on international trade issues since 1983, and is for me and many others a great source of expertise. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you very much for being with us at TradeWinds. Let me share a few details on our program. Minister Ng and Jeff will deliver some initial remarks to frame our conversation. We will then engage in a dialogue with all speakers, and I also hope to take a couple of questions from you in the audience, so please get ready to submit them using the Q&A tool. So on to our business. In the pre-COVID-19 world, trade conflicts, new technologies, and geopolitical competition were already reshaping global value chains. Goods producing supply chains had become less trade intensive and more regionally concentrated, while trade in service was growing much faster than trade in goods, boosted in part by digital technologies. International trade cooperation, fundamental to underpin cross-border production networks, was faltering. With managed trade gaining traction, greater fragmentation of trade rules, and weakening global governance, the WTO was under strain, and the business environment more uncertain and volatile. In this context comes COVID-19, wreaking havoc on supply chains and trade. Forced reduction in production as a result of containment measures, steep decline in sectors such as automobiles or textiles, and sharp increases in others such as medical gear, transportation disruptions, and unprecedented business uncertainty risk the breakdown of some of these production networks with increased unemployment and other dire consequences. So COVID-19 has brought to the forefront the key question of how to improve risk management in supply chain systems focused on optimization with little flexibility to absorb disruptions. Or more plainly, how to make sure that demand can be met with supply, even in extraordinary circumstances like COVID-19 or terrorist attacks or natural disasters or others. In the current context, trade policy has both helped and hindered this situation. According to the joint initiative between the Global Trade Alert, the European University Institute, and the World Bank, a total of 97 governments have liberalized trade in medical products and medicines, implementing a total of 142 reforms since early this year. In contrast, 85 governments have imposed 156 export controls. So at this point, the real risk is that as businesses rethink their global value chains, unilateral measures, buy local policies, import restrictions, export curbs, and other protectionist policies will get in the way of using trade to bring goods from where they are produced to where they are needed. And it is hard to think that even in a sector like medical goods or medicines, one country can produce everything it needs to fight a pandemic, not to say the cost impact such a decision would have if feasible. So how can international trade cooperation help governments refrain from politically appealing but self-defeating policies? Moreover, How can it help fight the current wave and future waves of COVID-19 and to recover from the pandemic? Is there a role for the WTO amid all its challenges in facilitating reversal of damaging measures and adopting new frameworks to promote greater trade cooperation? So to help us address some of these questions, let me now turn over to Minister Ng. And again, Minister, thank you very much. And we're very grateful that you're here with us at TradeWinds.
Thank you so very much. And good morning, everyone. Anabel, that was a wonderful introduction. And I want to thank you and the team at the Peterson Institute for International Economics for bringing us all together, albeit virtually. It's a pleasure to be able to share the stage virtually with you, Anabel, of course, with Jeff and my wonderful colleague, Ambassador De Boer. I apologize that I can't be here for as long as I would have liked to. I have to rush off to a cabinet meeting, so I'm going to spend as much time as I possibly can. And it's wonderful to be here as part of the debut episode of TradeWinds, and I certainly will be looking forward to following future episodes. And, as you've highlighted, we know, Anabel, that this is a challenging time for people around the world and that citizens and business owners are worried about what's going to come next. Our government believes that supporting people economically at the same time as protecting their health is the best way to help Canadians through this extraordinary time. We've taken decisive action to help businesses keep their costs low, their teams together, and to provide them with the funds that they need to keep up with their operations, even while many have had to close or scale back their operations in our collective effort to fight COVID-19. We also recognize that in this interconnected world, we must look beyond our own borders to support our businesses and our people. We know that businesses and workers depend on stability, predictability, and open global supply chains to get access to the goods and the services that they need when they need them. That's why I'm working hard with my international counterparts to prevent unnecessary trade barriers from going up. And as COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting groups like women entrepreneurs and small business owners, people who are already underrepresented in global trade even before this crisis. International cooperation and collaboration is vital to ensuring our ongoing efforts are inclusive and sustainable. And as we look to restarting our economy, we must ensure that everyone can continue to access the benefits of trade. Canada is working with our international partners, including the G20, the World Trade Organization, and APEC, and others, to keep the trade and supply chains open, to remove unnecessary tariffs on personal protective equipment and medical supplies, and to support the essential sectors like agriculture access the global marketplace, especially at a critical time like this. Our work continues so that Canadian companies can continue doing business around the world so that Canadians can get the food, the medicine, and other essential goods that they can rely on. Canada believes that a reliable, rules-based international trading system with the WTO at its core is crucial for businesses of every size in every sector across every region of the country. Canada, with Ambassador De Boer leading the charge in Geneva, has played a leadership role in 3 recent joint statements with like-minded WTO nations. The first saw 42 WTO members reiterate the need to maintain predictable and rules-based trade amid COVID-19. The second saw 28 WTO members reinforce international cooperation on trade in agriculture and agri-food products, ensuring people in Canada and around the world can access the food and agricultural products that they need. The third saw 49 WTO members commit to addressing the immediate economic challenges faced by micro, small, and medium-sized businesses throughout this crisis and beyond. These statements help build resilience and prepare the foundation for future trade policy actions, ultimately supporting businesses around the world to access more customers and to create more jobs. These statements are more than just expressions of principle. They help to build resilience and prepare the ground for future trade policy actions to address the challenges we face. To ensure that the WTO addresses the realities of trade today, Canada has taken concrete steps in creating the Ottawa Group on WTO reform, a family of WTO members united in their commitment to strengthen and to modernize the WTO. I will be convening a virtual meeting of my Ottawa Group counterparts very soon to carry this conversation forward. But Canada and the other 12 WTO members of the Ottawa Group can only do so much. Ultimately, WTO reform efforts will require the engagement of all members to succeed. So bringing in that same spirit of determination and cooperation that so many in the international community have shown in their COVID-19 response to modernizing the WTO so that we can continue to do this important work. And after all, the best way for us to get through this, Canada believes, through these challenges that face us today, is by facing them together and by working together. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Minister Ng, for your remarks. Let me now turn it over to Jeff Schott to hear from him. Jeff?
Thank you very much, Anabel. And I have little that I could add to the very fine remarks of Minister Ng. I think she has expressed the optimism that we need to work together going forward. Unfortunately, I live in Washington, and it's very hard to be optimistic because we had a crisis in the trading system before the pandemic, and the pandemic has made it worse. And we see some of the responses of the US government and others that are running counter to some of the cooperative ambitions that Minister Ng has talked about and is working for. And I strongly congratulate her for her efforts and hope that they bear fruit sooner rather than later. But we have seen governments, because of the demand shock that has reduced economic output and caused massive unemployment in many countries, we've seen countries resort to beggar thy neighbor policies through the imposition of export controls, through import restrictions, through various recovery programs that have introduced massive resources to bail out national firms caught in the demand downdrift. This has been a level of state intervention across the economy that seems unprecedented for Western democracies. Now, when governments have gotten together in the G20 and the G7, in WTO forums, they have talked about the need to avoid, whenever necessary, taking actions that are not in compliance with WTO rules. But we all know that the WTO rule book is sometimes ambiguous and often has exceptions for health and safety or national security reasons that allow the imposition of export controls or import restrictions on a rather flexible basis. And we've seen many countries do that, even though leadership would argue they should avoid invoking the rights that exist under the WTO to interfere with trade and investment that is disrupting supply chains. Businesses have had to deal with that. They're the ones that have to figure out how best to work in a climate of at least short-term demand, big drop in demand. And they have been trying to alter their supply chains, restructure them, in some cases reshoring, but often building in redundancies to ensure that there's adequate production in to feed their adequate supplies to feed their production facilities. This means looking internationally and maintaining international ties, because disruptions in supply chains have also occurred in countries where the suppliers are domestic. Look at our meatpacking industry in the United States, for example, but in many other areas as well. So it is a combination of some restructuring, some needed redundancy in supply chains, which will add costs to be sure, but probably are a necessary insurance policy against future shocks from policy changes or pandemics. And in that context, I think the WTO and WTO member governments need to look forward, but start working right away on the key challenges that are going to arise as we move out of the pandemic, as hopefully the pandemic abates, and start the process of recovering from the deep losses that have been occurred in the past few months. That will require looking at a number of issues that have been on the international trade agenda for decades. First and foremost, access to medicines, which has been a contentious issue in the WTO for a long time, but now is critical as many companies around the world are struggling and working fiercely to develop new vaccines and therapeutics to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. As that succeeds, there has to be a way to ensure that there is access to these vaccines, that the vaccines can be produced in quantities sufficient to meet global demand, and that supply and that distribution channels are open so that rich and poor alike have access to these vaccines. This is a global pandemic, and it won't be resolved unless there is a global response that covers rich and poor alike. This gets into many issues of intellectual property, but it also other more traditional border measures that need to be looked at in the spirit of resolving the conflict. I've been mostly negative, Anabel, but there is an area that offers some hope, and that is the WTO has been working on digital trade. And as most of us who have been shut at home or have found out that the operation of e-commerce is particularly important and welcome, and has been a new source of economic activity and job creation. And I think this only indicates that governments should redouble their efforts to bridge the gaps in positions that have slowed progress on developing new rules on digital trade, so that the opportunities for expanding trade and investment are opened up as economies open up going forward. So brief introductory remarks, but hope this helps start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, to you as well. And again, thank you to Minister Ng for some very fine remarks indeed. So a number of issues, I think, to unpack in both of your introductory remarks. So let me take the point about robustness of supply chains. So Jeff, you were mentioning that we're going to probably see greater rebalancing towards resilience, towards redundancy, to make sure that efficiency-seeking value chains also incorporate a greater element of risk management. And I think you pointed out the case about this becomes very critical when we think, for instance, about the vaccine for COVID-19, where we need the vaccine, of course, to be developed, to be tested. But once we're ready to go, it's going to be, we're going to need to produce it in several places around the world, and trade lanes will need to keep open so that the vaccine can reach everyone across the world. So I want to link this to a first question that I would like to pose to Minister Ng, which is, what kind of trade policies do you think are needed to improve the robustness of global value chains? Because we're talking about vaccines here, but we're also talking about food products, and we're talking about more broadly, how do we make sure that these supply chains that were very focused on efficiency can work in an environment where you're going to need to ramp up production, you're going to meet an increased supply, and to make sure that these goods can be delivered to where they are needed. Minister, let me turn it over to you now.
I just had to unmute a little bit. That's absolutely a very, very good question, and indeed, you know, top of mind and continues to be on my mind and many, many others here in our government to ensure that so that we are on a track to to enable that very scenario that you described to emerge. So we know that that the shocks that have been caused right now. We understand the disruptions to the international supply chains. It's under significant pressure, all around the world. It's why we need to make sure we're not, that we do the work to prevent new trade barriers from going up, and make sure that when, that countries that have, to ensure that we collectively do the work to make sure they're targeted, they're transparent, they're proportionate, and that they're temporary. So the advantage that the advantage of working together as we need to with our international partners, so that we can ensure that dependability and that that predictability of the global supply chains can continue to do their work, is absolutely essential. I think now more than ever, we should not be using COVID-19 as an excuse to stop trading. We should not use COVID-19 as a way of being able to erect protectionist measures and trade policies. And in fact, now more than ever, we have to collaborate and find those like-minded countries to be able to essentially work together so that we can ensure not only the safety of our people around medical supplies and those essential goods that is absolutely critical, and the production of them, and then the access to them globally to everywhere around the globe, including those developing countries. Because I think it's only that we're actually going to get to both prosperity, eventual prosperity for our businesses, but ultimately in the short term, the health and safety of all of our people here in Canada and indeed around the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Minister. Let me now bring in Jeff and take one question from the audience, which is related to what the Minister was saying, which is, we have here Fernando Laguarda asking, can you be specific about what is meant by international cooperation on trade? What concrete actions require cooperation, and what form does that cooperation take? I think the Minister was making reference before to 3 joint initiatives that a number of countries have taken in the context of the WTO. And I would say that the common thread across those initiatives is to keep trade lanes open. And I think, Minister Ng, you were saying this will set the tone for future actions to come in this area. So, Jeff, what do you think is, what is it that we mean by international trade cooperation?
Let me start. I think Minister Ng really set the broad guidelines for the answer to your question. But what we need are, as a practical matter, are the major trading nations to get together, to cooperate, to keep the markets open. And the G20 attempted to do that, but wiggled their way out of commitments that changed their existing policies, which in some cases have resulted in export controls or import restrictions to garner scarce supplies of medicines or medical equipment or foodstuffs. So what is more appropriate, what is more needed, are what middle-level powers have been doing. New Zealand, Singapore, Canada has joined in many of these, in cooperating in saying we are not going to impose new border measures, export or import. We are not going to invoke rights that we have, because we know if countries do that, it is going to impede the process of economic recovery. We're not seeing that from the major trading nations that have to be contributing and leading by example. And unfortunately, I'll name names. It's the United States, it's the European Union, it's China, have all imposed export restrictions that have complicated and encumbered the process of economic recovery.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Minister, I want to take it from where Jeff was saying about the role of mid-sized countries like Canada. From your perspective, what is the role of a mid-sized country like Canada to help us, navigate the new sort of COVID-19 era in the context of the WTO? And I would like to link that then after your intervention, bringing Stephen in with a question that we have from Carlos Primo Braga in the audience, who says, a liberal trade system cannot survive without the explicit support of the largest world economies, as Jeff was mentioning. Given the growing US-China tensions about COVID-19, is it inevitable that we will fall back into a fragmented trading system organized in spheres of influence with echoes of the Cold War? So, Minister Ng, to you, what is the role of mid-sized countries like Canada? And then, Stephen, can we actually go forward without the support of the larger players, as Jeff was saying? Minister Ng.
Yeah, absolutely, Anabel. I mean, Canada, like every other WTO member, shares that goal of ensuring that trade flows are smooth, there's predictability, it moves as freely as possible. And that's essential because businesses need that stability. And the WTO, of course, has been an important convener for countries sort of over time. And what Canada can do, and I would say we have been doing, we are able to build some consensus. We're able to take the leadership in bringing together like-minded countries who do believe in the role of the WTO, who do believe in multilateral systems, who do believe in a rules-based system that really will help and guide all of us to the benefit of our people. So I think the role that Canada plays, and we indeed do, it's why we created the Ottawa Group with a number of countries where we can have where we can bring people together and have those conversations and those dialogues and try to build some consensus around some of those very difficult issues that we're all facing. And with that consensus building, bring it out to a wider group, and absolutely, to the other major economies. So we are able to build that consensus. We are able to take that leadership. And I think that begins to set a tone, but it also helps really have those conversations with others who are like-minded in an effort to be able to put those ideas on the table for further collaboration and for further, we hope, adoption, because we're able to take on that consensus building leadership convening role.
Thank you very much. It is true, I guess, that in the context of a place like the WTO, consensus building is something that happens a step at a time, and that you need leadership coming from different parts of the world to actually make it happen. So I think what you're doing is actually a great service, not only to your citizens, but actually to citizens across the world. But it is true that we also need the big players. So Stephen, let me now bring you in with this question that we received from Carlos Primo Braga in our audience. Are we gonna see greater fragmentation in the system in a post-COVID-19 world? What do you think?
So I think it's important for all of us to take a step back. COVID-19 has not been around for very long. So we've seen, as Jeffrey has pointed out, we've seen a number of large members take actions that we think run counter to that spirit of open and liberal markets. But these are still early days. And to speak to what Minister Ng was saying about the middle powers, about organizations like the Ottawa Group, to build consensus, we need to start making the case and for the larger members to take on this notion and to remember that it is in all of our economic interests to keep these markets open. And not only is it in our economic interest, it's also the way we're going to collectively deal with the pandemic. We need to have open supply chains. We need to have, as Jeffrey said, these multiple sources of PPE, of all of these materials. And so we need to start making, as middle powers, as the Ottawa Group, start creating that narrative to remind the larger members. But let's not get too carried away about what the larger members are doing. It's early days, and I think that the case can be made. We're already seeing some change in attitudes with respect to the EU, for example. And let's be serious. I mean, for many governments, of course, the reaction is to pull up the drawbridge and to say we need to take care of ourselves, and then we need to start having that conversation about why that's not actually useful for our own economic or health interests. So I'd like to remain optimistic that there's a role for countries like Canada, and that there is a narrative that the larger trading partners will start to adopt.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. Let me maybe take it from here and go back to say, okay, so we're facing COVID-19 right now. We also had a major disruption to the global economy with the 2008 financial crisis. And at that time, we saw countries coming together to reject protectionism, basically say, no, we're not going to turn inwards in these times of financial uncertainty, and committing themselves not to raise barriers to trade and investment, not to impose new export restrictions, or to implement WTO inconsistent measures to stimulate exports. So fast forward to now, 12 years later, where we are facing the dramatic crisis of the COVID-19, and we see a different role being played by the G20. So I know that, Jeff, you have written about this topic, and you mentioned it briefly. I'd like to hear from you. What do you think has been the response of the G20, specifically in the area of trade and investment in the context of COVID-19? And then also hear from Minister Ng in the sense that, what role do you think the G20 should have in this divided world, but what role for the G20 in fighting protectionism and keeping those trade lanes open? So Jeff, let me turn it over to you first. And you need to unmute, Jeff.
First, let me start by saying Stephen is right that we are only a few months into this crisis, and government officials are learning by doing, and they realize more and more that they need to work together to come up with global solutions. There's no national solution to a crisis unless you want to seal yourself off for a long, long time. I think it's unfortunate to try to compare the financial crisis of 12 years ago with what we're facing today. Because the financial crisis of 12 years ago was generated by imbalances in many economies and required a lengthy period of recuperation and restoration. There really wasn't a major problem in most economies earlier this year before the pandemic hit. And what we've seen is a sharp contraction, a much sharper contraction than during the financial crisis, to basically mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 virus. So that's a difference. The G20 acting 12 years ago made very broad and extensive pledges, but in hindsight, they didn't implement them. So there was a lot of good talk, but a lot of the trade measures, at least, were spotty. The implementation was spotty and ineffectual. I think today we're seeing that the road to recovery can be quicker than from the financial crisis if we work together. In 2008, we had strong leadership from the United States. Today, there is concern that America First is constraining the scope of U.S. global leadership. And that's my biggest worry going forward. But I think there is some room for working together, but it has to be shared responsibility and shared commitments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. Minister Ng, your experience in working in the context of the G20, what role for G20 really in the current world in trying to bring greater cooperation to deal with this COVID-19 situation?
Anabel, I think Minister Ng has left the meeting, unfortunately.
Oh, so that brings you in then, Stephen, and let me sort of turn that question to you, and maybe add one point, which is so we have the G20 and the larger economies. We've heard some mid-sized economies are actually sort of bringing in new initiatives. What more can we expect from your front? What are you thinking? What should be next as we pave the way with these joint initiatives that were mentioned before? What additional trade action can we expect? At least the initiative coming from Canada.
So I would say this, and this is what makes the pandemic different than the political rhetoric around the 2008 Great Recession, in that there is a fairly sophisticated conversation already starting about what this means with respect to e-commerce, and Jeff has pointed this out already. And also, as Minister Ng pointed out, 46 or 47 WTO members issued a statement with respect to MSMEs. There's a real sense that the pandemic will be very harmful to MSMEs, and that we have to start talking about the rule book that will actually be helpful to MSMEs. And this has not been a very developed conversation, but I think it's going to start happening. The one conversation that's really not happening at all yet, that needs to happen, is around trade and services. This is another aspect of COVID-19, of the pandemic, that we need to be talking about. At first blush, it's about medical professionals and health professionals, but it's also other aspects of the services sector. Tourism services, for example, is really getting punched in the head over the pandemic. And so, is this an opportunity for us to have that conversation and to talk about liberalizing and creating a new rule book that facilitates trade in services? Most immediately, I would say right now, the discussion, and in the Ottawa group as well, there's a fair bit of interest around, or actually a lot of interest around, medical supplies. And what can we do to reduce the barriers to trade in medical supplies, keep those markets open and those supply chains open? So there is scope for work, but I find it interesting that even 10, 12 weeks after the pandemic, we've already started moving that discussion to what we see are some of the knock-on effects of closing our economies with respect to MSMEs, with respect to e-commerce and supply chains.
Thank you. I'd like to bring a couple of questions from the audience, and we have some very good questions here, but I'm going to sort of bring two of them into one, which is from Gopalakrishanan Manikandan and from Matthew Wilson, which are bringing in the development angle of this, which is that we know global supply chains have been instrumental in integrating a number of developing countries into the global economy, reducing poverty in these countries, and overall generating, promoting growth and development in these places. And when we see their question is, going forward, you see fundamental shifts in global value chains in terms of manufacturing activities shifting to developed countries in order to address their own socioeconomic needs, how the global cooperation will result in development outcomes for developing countries. And then a concern expressed by Matthew Wilson from the ITC on whether the impact of some of this, measures to build resilience or others, in particular on onshoring or nearshoring, what will be the impact on some producers in developing countries, particularly in Africa? And I would like to add to that, which is, okay, so what will be the impact of, reconfiguration of global supply chains on developing countries? And I would like to bring in, is it important for many of these developing countries that, greater cooperation on these critical trade issues takes place as a means of making sure that global value chains are reconfigured based on fundamentals rather than policy restrictions, if you wish. So Jeff, do you want to come in on this one?
Well, I will start off, though only one of the three of us has represented a developing country in international negotiations. So I think she should also add her perspective, her knowledge on.
So you're putting the question back to me, and I'll take it, but let me hear from you first.
Okay. Well, I think it's critical that developing countries are not disengaged from supply chains. And there is a risk that that'll happen, particularly as major economies try to subsidize the reshoring of investment. And there are some countries that have been doing that, devoting lots of resources, South Korea, Taiwan, India, for example. But my impression is that it was mostly a reaction to the US-China trade war and trying to develop a defensive strategy against that, and wasn't meant to bring in all investment back home. I think for developing countries who don't have the resources to do that extensive subsidization, it's critical to improve the investment climate in their economies so that they can support and encourage more investment for regional production. This will be critical with regard to medicines and other and medical supplies, for example. And that's a first step. There could be some work on an investment facilitation agreement, like the trade facilitation agreement that was developed in the WTO 7 years ago. That would help them in that regard and provide technical and financial assistance. I think that issue needs to be moved up on the priority on the WTO agenda.
Yeah. I think you're right, and to me, one important sort of aspect of this discussion on supply chains and international trade cooperation is this angle, the development angle, if you wish, which is supply chains have been instrumental for countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, my own country, Costa Rica, and many others, to actually, integrate them into the world economy, as I said, generate good jobs, and start climbing the ladder of development. And we know that, in a way, technology was already posing some challenges. The sort of geopolitical competition was also weighing down on it. But for many of these countries, I think a critical point is keeping this supply chains open, supply chains flowing, trade lanes open. And this brings us back to some of the initiatives that are being discussed in the context of the WTO, but also in the context of countries that are like-minded, or also in the context of regional dimensions. And I think we have talked here of many different areas because this is a broad topic, but you both have been mentioning, so there are like orders of priority, if you wish. The one first point is to address everything that is needed to fight COVID-19. And here the question, we have one question from Rashid Benjaloun, and he says, would be a good idea really to start telling less developed countries that because you cannot get things from other parts of the world, you need to start producing your own things back home. Is that really a good idea, or is it really even feasible? So that's one first order of magnitude. There are other topics that then become very relevant. And I think that you both have mentioned, and we have also a couple of questions from the audience, the topic of e-commerce. Because if anything, COVID-19 has sort of moved us to that dimension with a greater push than we had before. But we still don't have global rules in this area. We have a number of trade agreements that incorporate chapters on e-commerce, but we still have very limited set of provisions at the multilateral level. So I'd like to pose the question to both of you. Do you think e-commerce negotiations in the WTO should actually take a priority sort of position right now? And is that something that is feasible? Can we expect to see progress in this context? So maybe, Jeff, I bring this to you first, and then Stephen, I'll bring you in as well.
Well, actually, let me pass it to Stephen because he's in the seat of responsibility as ambassador, and I'm just the kibitzer on the sidelines, and then I can follow up.
So this is well, thank you for that, Jeff. Yes, I do think this needs to be a priority, and I think there's a number of lessons that we've learned. Some of them you've spoken about, Jeff, and you, Anabel, have spoken about already. That the pandemic sort of underscores the need for global rules with respect to electronic commerce. But it's also interesting in how the fact that we're now meeting virtually has actually moved the discussion forward as to how we might actually negotiate an e-commerce agreement. And so on the 11th of June, the JSI will get back together virtually. And for the first time, they're going to be engaging with capital-based experts. Our hope is that over time, and by over time, I mean in the next couple of weeks or months, they'll start to be able to make decisions and move the negotiations forward in a virtual platform. So there's both the sort of the conceptual notions about what e-commerce means, and then there's the very practical aspects to it. Because what we're hearing at the WTO from many countries is that they can't use a virtual platform for decision making. That still is going to require the old-fashioned, we get into the CR or Room W and hammer out a deal. Well, in the current pandemic and in the current health context, that doesn't necessarily make sense. So we've got the conceptual issue that we need to address and the practical issue. And pandemic is sort of driving both of those together in an interesting way. I think e-commerce will lead us on that.
That's a very interesting point that you're making in terms of, from all of these changes that we will get as a result of the pandemic, that trade negotiations can actually, there's a place for virtual trade negotiations to take place, which would be something very interesting. And we have a question here precisely from Jackson Wong, who was asking, will the COVID-19 accelerate WTO negotiations on e-commerce? And it's interesting that even if it does not accelerate those negotiations, which we hope will do, it's interesting that it may, sort of introduce a new modality of trade negotiations, which is something that it'd be interesting to see how it evolves. Let me just, we're coming to an end.
Can I just add one point on this,
yes,
Anabel? Rules are one thing, and they're important. And there is already one good proposal in terms of rules that have been put forward by the United States and its trading partners in the TPP and in North America and with US, Japan, that sets out an agreement on digital trade. But there are still areas of controversy with regard to privacy and other issues that complicate the ability of getting a broader multilateral agreement. But in addition to rules, it's important to emphasize that you have to also emphasize investment in the infrastructure needed to conduct e-commerce, to have the appropriate platforms, the financial platforms and the like, the telecommunications resources, so that countries can take advantage of this. And that's a business investment decision that can involve both private companies and governments.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I guess one important point that we can take out of this conversation is that ultimately the reconfiguration of global supply chains is a business decision. It will be based on fundamentals like cost of production, transportation cost, availability of resources, and others. But the important part is, how can countries or governments work together to ensure that those decisions can be taken without policies that have the aim of moving those decisions in one direction or another, in particular, because that may end up being very detrimental in many different ways. Now, I think we're coming to the end of our first episode of Trade Winds. I want to thank very much Minister Ng, Ambassador DeBoer, my colleague Jeff Schott, for a very interesting conversation. I think that I have been taking notes here, and I have like my next 10 episodes of Trade Winds already, my topics lined up, be it e-commerce, be it this idea of tourism, are we gonna need to come together and forge rules to be able to foster tourism, a critical service for so many developing countries as well. So we got a very long list of topics, but I think this has been, from my side at least, a very good start of our conversations, the types of conversations that we expect to have in Trade Winds. To all of you who have joined us or who will be listening to us later on, I would very much appreciate your comments and suggestions as to the way forward. And let me just conclude, of course, by thanking Minister Ng, Ambassador DeBoer, thanking Jeff again, and saying that I'm delighted that in our next session, we will have Arantxa González Laya, the Spanish Minister of International Affairs, who will be joining us to discuss WTO in the post-COVID-19 world. And this will take place on next Wednesday, June 3rd. So please follow us on Twitter at PIIE Trade Winds to learn more about this next session. And I hope that you will also share with your friends that there's a new webinar in town, Trade Winds, where hopefully we will all learn from our esteemed guest about what is the future of global commerce in the area of the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, thanks a lot, Jeff. Stephen, thank you very much. Mary as well. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Goodbye.